Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. My name is Shailesh Kumar. My pronouns are he, his. I'm a member of the event organizing team and the moderator for this session. I want to make you aware that closed captioning is available. We also have the ASL interpretation with us. To view a live transcription, click the live transcript button on the bottom menu and select show subtitle. Also, in order to secure the space, you cannot rename yourself. Once you have entered, we are sorry if you were unable to add your pronouns to your name already, but we urge you to do so before you log into the next session. In dreaming of this event, our team was inspired by words adapted from Project NIA. Abolitionist futures are not compatible with white supremacy, settler colonialism, misogyny, heterosexism, transphobia, ableism, and classism. Yet these systems of oppression are all around us and affect even this event space. The hope our team has for this session is that organizers, presenters, and participants, particularly those of us who carry a lot of privilege, are mindful of the differential impacts of power and have the courage to hold to account anyone here who exercises power in ways that enact harm. If one of our organizers removes you from this session, our intention is not to punish nor to exclude you, but to practice care for the abolitionist community we are building. So thanks for joining in. For question and answer session, which we'll have at the end of this session, you can either put your question in the chat, or you can put your name or a question mark, and then you can unmute and ask the question. So we have 3 presentations here. So we'll begin with the first one. Thanks so much. Jesse, there you go.
Thank you so much. So my name is Jesse Ye, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Michigan's Public Policy and Sociology program. Today, I'll be sharing with you part of my dissertation research. So more broadly, I'm interested in changes in law and order politics. And today I will be talking about I support the movement, but how non-Black activists interpret and respond to defund the police. So as a way of context, right, as we all are familiar with, during the past summer since the murder of George Floyd, that we have seen an unprecedented influx of especially mainstream support on Black Lives Matter movement. Right. And it is also around that time that we begin to see defund the police kind of coalescing as one of the main demand of the movements. And so it becomes a question that I'm curious about, which is how do non-Black liberal activists interpret and respond to the call to defund the police, right? And so I went about and interviewed 32 non-Black liberal electoral activists in 2 suburban Southern California counties. This is part of my broader dissertation project where I'm interested in just how both liberal and conservative activists interpret the changes in law and order politics since the Trump administration. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'll focus only on the responses of my liberal respondents. So on the right-hand side, you're able to see the demographic breakdown of my respondents. And I would just take the opportunity to note that my respondents tend to skew older. So about 2/3 of them are above the age of 50, and about 2/3 of them are white women, right? And as I'm speaking to my respondents across age, race, or gender, they all kind of acknowledge that this is the case for the organizations that they are involved in, right? That it tends to be people who are retired or older who have the time to participate. And as is commonly known, that women are often the kind of, the main bulk of people who are keeping our civic life running, right? So it's not surprising that it's mostly women and white women with means who are involved. So I interview my respondents for roughly around 2 hours. I came into my project mostly wanted to know about law and order politics in relation to immigration and immigration enforcement. However, and I'm just asking them questions about their activisms, about how they participated in the 2016 and the 2020 elections, and about criminal justice as a way to contextualize it. However, what I immediately realized is that a lot of them really want to talk about defund the police, right? That I didn't even initially set out to ask them any question about defund the police. And the first handful of them just really wanted to talk about it. So then I started to systematically track what is it that they said. It is important for us to kind of take a slight detour and say, why do we even care about this group of people, right? That this is a movement for Black lives, and we should center what Black folks are thinking about, right? And I do acknowledge that it doesn't mean that we want to center what those people are thinking, but it is on a practical term important for us to know what it is that they're thinking, right? So these are an influential bunch of people, right? So even among the people that I've interviewed, a handful of them have ran for local offices. They're, city council member, mayors, county boards, people who are in local office who do have a lot of influence over criminal justice policies. And a handful of them are also having ambition to run for even higher offices. Even for people who are not running for office, these electoral activists are the people who are supplying the money, the donation to fund campaigns, right? They are volunteering to go out and knock on doors. And the group as a whole, the organizations, are the ones who are giving endorsements, right? And these are oftentimes things that can sway a local or a congressional election, right? I've spoken to one of my respondents who ran for city council, who lost by 40 votes, and he did not get endorsed by his local Democratic Party. And he is very clear that if he had been and had access to the kinds of money and volunteers to staff his campaign, that he could have easily gotten that 40 votes and win the election. So this is an influential bunch, right? And lastly, these are also people who get elected as party delegates to county, to state, to federal Democratic Party, and are able to write resolutions about the party platform, right? So this is on practical term why they're influential. And I think, for the purpose of research on social movement, it is also, we don't know a lot about this group of people, right? And specifically, we don't know a lot about people who consider themselves as allies, right? People who are not direct constituents or, directly involved for the change that they're advocating, and especially ally activism across race. So this is an important group for us to know more about. Right. So for the purpose of this presentation, I focus on the parts of my data where either when my respondents gave any unprompted mentions about policing, or their answer to my standardized question, which I asked everyone regardless, which is, over the past year, one important issue is the police killing of unarmed Black people and the protests that follow. What are your thoughts about it? Right. And I want to highlight that this is the question that I asked, because I think as we move on to what their answers are, this is something that I think is important to contextualize. So here are the four main things that I have found. Right. So first and foremost, every single liberal activist that I've spoken to expressed support for Black Lives Matter. Many, however, took issues with quote unquote defund the police. And they want to emphasize, right, that the only thing that they have issue with is the wording defund the police, and they actually support the idea of it, right? And then very few of them in turn mentioned who originated this demand, or why is it that this demand was formed. And then lastly, many of them centered what police officers or conservatives might think in their evaluation about the claim to defund the police, right? So let me walk through my findings quickly. So first and foremost, right, every single liberal respondent that I've spoken to articulated support for Black Lives Matter when I asked them. And I just wanted to emphasize, right, that I'm now going into the stage of my fieldwork where I'm instead interviewing conservative respondents, and this is definitely not the case with them, right? So this is not trivial that every single liberal respondents that I've spoken to support Black Lives Matter. Right. And many of them participated in the protests over the summer of 2020. And given the kind of advanced age of the respondents that I've spoken to, this is also a big deal, right? That as Kevin has said, even though he's at high risk for COVID, at his advanced year, it still affected him enough to risk his well-being and go out to protest. Right. And a lot of them have been involved even prior to the summer of 2020. right? So for example, Lillian, one of the person I've spoken to, introduced a resolution to the county party to ban police chokehold as one of the Democratic Party's platform. Marco ran for city council, and one of his main platform was to create a civilian police oversight commission, right? Sarah, actually, her very, very first political awakening is around racial injustice in the criminal justice system. And she was one of the co-founder of a racial justice organization in her city, beginning 2014. Right. So those are folks who, not only support the movement, they are active, they're doing things, and a lot of them have been involved in a long time. Right. However, when I asked them to imagine, and also at the same time, when I asked them to imagine, well, can you think of anyone who would not support the movement and why they would not support the movement? Here's what they have to say, right? So I asked Virginia if she can imagine anyone who doesn't support the movement and why is it? Virginia said, well, because they are stupid, right? They are uneducated. They don't look at the whole picture. Unlike her, who was able to go to an Ivy League school, they're uneducated. Right. Sarah also mentioned that she believed that it's probably because of the racist instincts that they are unable to support the movement. Right. And lastly, Tom said he believes that Republicans are rooted in fear, and this fear makes it hard for them to be a tolerant person. So, however, when I asked them about defund the police specifically, it is a completely different picture, right? So many very kind of viscerally, strongly, vehemently objected to it, right? So I hate the word defund the police. It is a stupid slogan. It is ludicrous. I hate this slogan so much, right? However, they are really, really quick to emphasize that it is only the slogan and just the slogan that they oppose to and not the concept, right? So if I point your attention to Cameron's quote, right? I never want to be associated, myself, projecting the message defund the police because it's a terrible slogan, but I love the idea, right? Fuck yeah, let's defund the police and reprioritize the money, right? So here we can see that oftentimes just even in the same sentence, they really, really want to make sure that it comes across that the only thing that they take issue with is the slogan, and the idea of defunding the police, they do support, right? And so it becomes worthwhile for us to think a little bit about what is it that they do think defund the police is about, if not the slogan defund the police, right? And I found that there are 4 things that people are attributing to what the real idea of defund the police is, right? So first and foremost, they think defund the police means reform and training. Right. So for example, Lisa, who's a retired professor, said, those kinds of slogans really hurt us. They did, right? I think the notion of adding to or changing training, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Another thing that people think defund the police means is to increase funding for mental health resources, right? So for example, Carrie had said, I hate this defunding the police, but I totally agree with what it really is supposed to mean. Let the police do their police work, but let mental health people and other resources come to help these non-criminal aspects, right? And I want to emphasize here that both training and funding mental health resource might not be necessarily mutually exclusive with defunding the police, but we can also imagine scenarios in which creating new or different trainings or adding mental health personnel into the police force actually ends up being putting more money into policing and giving police more power, right? And that is not defunding the police, right? Another 2 ways that people have thought about defund the police is reallocating funds to social programs, right? And here, even though it is closer to the idea of defund the police, what I want to emphasize that they really want to de-emphasize the parts about taking money away from the police, right? So for example, Jessica said, I think it's not so much about defunding the police, it's more about reallocating the resource, right? And Sarah also said what it really meant is to divert the funding to fund human services, right? So here, they wanted to make sure that it is not that they think there's a problem with policing and for our purpose that they are not supporting abolition, but they want to make sure that human services get more funding, right? So we can also imagine a scenario which in the end that we don't touch policing or we just move money away from policing, but not necessarily power away from them in order to fund human services. right? The last thing that people have attributed to defund the police is fiscal prudence and efficiency, right? And so here they're similarly just thinking of policing as, wasting our public money and inefficient, and wanting to, for example, staff them with volunteer code enforcers, right? And this, we can imagine a whole slew of problems, though, even though we might not be putting money into policing, that we're still not questioning police power, right? So how are people able to, at the same breath, say that they, support the movement and support the idea of defund the police, but saying that they, object to the slogan itself, right? And an important way in which people have done that is by skipping over who are the people who originated the demand, right? So for example, Kevin said, defund the police, could not pick a stupider slogan, right? Here, he very carefully skipped over who are the people who picked the slogan, right? So in the interest of time, I want to skip over to my fourth finding, which is that people instead talk a lot about police and conservatives when they are thinking about making evaluations of defund the police, right? So they take on the perspective of police officers. Many of them made it relevant about their personal relationship of police officers and conservative folks, right? And so in the last couple of seconds, I just wanted to wrap up and say, right? So since the summer of 2020, we did see a support for Black Lives Matter really, really grow, right? It has become a liberal consensus to support it. And when they're expressing their support, they're also defining themselves against people who don't support it, right? So that includes people who are conservatives, people who are quote unquote uneducated, racist, and living in fear, right? And many are eager to emphasize that they do support the movement and its ideas, but just not the slogan, defund the police, right? And they're attributing a whole range of idea to what defund the police is really supposed to mean. And a lot of them don't actually take funding away from police, right? And most of them who criticize it also try to avoid naming who came up with it, right? And it is a lot easier for them to imagine how police officers or conservative folks who are in their life might feel either positively or negatively than for them to imagine themselves as someone who's Black or someone who suffer from violence and inequality at the hands of the police, or someone who might want to dismantle the system, right? So thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take more questions in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jesse. Now we have our second presentation by Roberto.
We're going to switch interpreters now, following with JSL interpreters.
Yes, if you want
on
to.
it. I'm working on it. Screen's moving on me. And a gentle reminder to presenters to maybe slow down your pace a bit to make the interpreter's job easier.
Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Roberto Mónico, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Comparative Ethnic Studies at CU Boulder. My dissertation, Los Angeles, William H. Parker, Race, Bias, Policing During the Red Scare, reexamines the era of Chief William H. Parker and the Los Angeles Police Department as the root causes of racial and class divisions in Los Angeles. So I believe that we need to revisit this era, the 50s and the early 60s, as the inception of modern day violent and racist policing methods that we find today within our communities. Hyperpolicing can be seen across the United States, and indeed it's led to the rise of mass incarceration. However, Los Angeles, William H. Parker, Race, Bias, and Policing During the Red Scare argues that Parker was not only responsible for transforming policing strategies that gave officers complete freedom to target communities of color, but also protected police from receiving any form of disciplinary actions wherever misconduct occurred in the African American and Mexican American communities. So my research project originally began as a master's thesis and evolved as a dissertation. I examined drug arrests in LAPD's annual reports from 1956 to 1957 when I noticed that African Americans and juveniles of Mexican descent had higher drug offenses than any of the other races. And I also noticed that these arrests were made in specific police divisions. So because I grew up in Los Angeles, I know these divisions and where they're located and how they relate to the racial demographics. So for example, Central Division primarily comprises of African Americans, while the Hollenbeck Division has mostly people of Mexican descent. Then I thought I needed to look at all the LAPD's annual reports in the 50s to determine if there was a pattern of offenses found within these communities. As I kept researching, I was intrigued by Parker's policing methods, so I started reading more on Parker and the strategies he implemented in the LAPD and found that he altered the course of policing. And he's revered as the man who is responsible for eliminating corruption, transforming policing into a profession that afforded a middle-class lifestyle. But the more I delved into his background, the more I learned of his racism toward the aforementioned communities. So the following is a portion of my dissertation. So on April 2nd, 1950, the Los Angeles City Commission appointed William H. Parker chief of Los Angeles Police Department in a 4-0 vote. So Parker held this position until he suffered a heart attack in 1966. During these 16 years, Parker revamped the department from an institution known for corruption into a model of police professionalism. He's accredited for professionalizing law enforcement in a myriad of ways. During his tenure, he restructured the core foundations of modern-day policing by introducing higher salaries, the use of aggregated data to quote unquote fight crime, and to transform the LAPD into a professional career option for white males. This change was incredibly significant as the LAPD would be emulated by a variety of police departments across the United States. So today, law enforcement officials still remember Parker as a visionary who transformed policing methods, a tough but shrewd policymaker who wielded power over a decentralized municipal council, and a man who often got what he demanded. However, Parker was also viewed as a racist and chauvinist tormentor by Angelino African Americans and people of Mexican descent living in Los Angeles. And I use the term people of Mexican descent because I'm conforming to the Latinx population during the time when there's hardly any other Central Americans or people from South America. And there was a mixture of people who had been living on the land for generations and people that were moving into California. So according to historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez, the city of Los Angeles became the carceral capital of the United States by the early 50s. So Parker was the head of the LAPD and claimed that the city was being overrun by an army of criminals without providing any proof to such an assertion. He once made this outrageous claim that the so-called faceless criminal army reached levels of 6 million people, all of whom were living within the interior of the United States. Though this may sound ridiculous, we should keep in mind that during this period, many African Americans were escaping the racial terrorism in the Jim Crow South, as well as people of Mexican descent relocating to Los Angeles because of the Bracero program. Parker was a skilled orator and who knew how to disseminate information to sway public opinion in his favor. In addition, he was an official consultant for the television show Dragnet, a program from the 1950s that portrayed local police officers as friendly, law-abiding, a crime-fighting force representing the community of Los Angeles. So Dragnet was viewed by millions of Americans weekly, and scenes of affable officers seeped into the consciousness of millions of Americans who tuned in. The television show may have been credited by Hollywood, in particular by the actor who played Joe Friday, Jack Webb, but Parker had a prominent role in editing scripts that presented a more quote-unquote authentic portrayal of the LAPD, reserving the right to halt production if he objected to any sort of technical grounds. So scripts needed to be submitted to the Public Information Division and subsequently approved by Parker before taping all the shows. So viewers believed this on-screen persona of police officers was a genuine portrayal of what constituted a trusted public servant. So as a purveyor of law enforcement, he strategically used these portrayals as a vehicle to gain the public's compliance and shape the ideas of the good and bad guy dichotomy. Because of this, Parker created a template for cop shows, often referred today as propaganda, where police are viewed as this disciplinary force, evoked the so-called to protect and serve motto, including shows like Adam 12, SWAT, and Law and Order. However, he was highly criticized by many civil rights organizations for his methods of racial profiling, warrantless raids, constant harassment, which often went unpunished. So while he was berating these civil rights organizations. Got to keep in mind that this was the Red Scare. He was saying that these civil rights organizations were being controlled by the Soviet Union and the Kremlin, particularly the Third International. So Parker defended his department by alleging that Black and brown communities had higher criminal activity than the predominantly white areas of Los Angeles, which at that time were mainly in the west side and central regions of the city. There was all this racial tension that was brewing in Los Angeles, persisted with Parker at the helm. He claimed that people of Mexican descent had a genetic predisposition for violence and once stated, and I quote, "The Latin population that came here in great strength were here before us and presented a great problem because I worked over on the east side when men had to work in pairs. And it's because some of these people not too far removed from the wild tribes of the district of the inner mountains of Mexico. I don't think you can throw out the genes of the question when discussing behavior patterns of people," end quote. So indeed, this sentiment was not only shared by the department, but often used to justify violent policing methods. Parker claimed that the people of Mexican descent committed 5 times more crime per capita than the white community, while insinuating that culture was the root cause of these problems. So he also argued that he was misrepresented in local African-American owned newspapers, never mentioning by name, but we can determine that he was probably speaking of the Los Angeles Sentinel and the California Eagle. So he ignored the commission reports and that these were examples of ignorances and biases towards his department. And he claimed that, quote, "certain minority groups were attempting to distract attention from the higher incidence of criminal activity within these groups," end quote. And that the press was unfairly focusing on police brutality instead of the bookings that overshadowed minor incidents of police conduct. So Parker attempted to divert attention away from the department's extra legal tactics by citing higher crime rates as a reason why the LAPD was policing aggressively toward these communities. The resentment, he contended, stemmed from Black and brown people's poor social and economic conditions. The burden should not fall on the LAPD, but on the non-white communities for having higher crime rates. Yet the crime rates during Parker's era was the pretext to send more police departments into these neighborhoods. So the use of statistics was also particularly important in criminalizing people of Mexican descent and African Americans. So under the guise of public safety, he criminalized these communities by claiming that more crime was committed in East and South Central Los Angeles. His dubious reputation as a law enforcement visionary distinguishes how he viewed Black and brown people during his 16-year tenure. His approach to combating crime called on an increase of police presence in specific areas of Los Angeles, using the crime statistics as a reason to deploy more police officers. He established a police structure that resembled a paramilitary force, giving him strict command over the department. So when the police commission tried to rein in the way the LAPD conducted its affairs in these non-white communities, he just ignored them. One commissioner stated that Parker, quote, "Parker rules the force with an iron hand." He added, "The chief of police is the most powerful official in the city," end quote. The use of statistics substantiated the need for more police as Parker paired police officers to patrol neighborhoods in East Los Angeles, falsifying that people of Mexican descent were prone to committing more crime than the Anglo population. He criticized anyone who believed hindered the department's policing practices, including the state Supreme Court. So on April 27th, 1955, in a 4-3 ruling, the Supreme Court of California ruled in People versus Cahan to overturn the conviction of Charles Cahan due to the LAPD's illegal use of a dictograph. It's a wiretapping machine. So the court ruled that the use of the dictograph machine violated constitutional guarantees against unreasonable seizures and searches, but still collecting evidence by violating civil procedures was of little concern to Parker. He contended that there was no evidence in which he exceeded his authority in the Cahan case. And he wrote in 1955, quote, "At the present time, I am the defendant in a civil action designed to test my legal authority to use the dictograph in obtaining evidence in criminal cases, despite the fact that there is not one shred of evidence that this authority has been abused," end quote. So for him, using this type of equipment meant using an effective tool for fighting crime. He opined that his department was severely hampered by depriving the use of the dictograph. Moreover, his rhetoric was not only used to convince the general public of the importance of utilizing such crime prevention techniques, but he attacked anyone who disagreed with his assessment of how he was combating alleged crime. He stated, quote, "You can't blame the police. You must blame the higher courts of the state and the prosecutors who favor the Kahan decision and the legislators who have failed to do something about it," end quote. So at any given chance, Parker criticized anyone who disagreed with him, as the Kahan decision was subsequently used as a deflection in the 1960 LAPD's annual reports. So the 1960 publication blamed the court's decision on higher crime rates, as the LAPD cited statistics to support their dubious claim that the crime rose 72% from 1954. So ultimately, the state Supreme Court invoked the exclusionary evidence rule, barring police officers from forcible entries and illegal seizures. So moreover, Parker clashed with then California Governor Edmund Brown over surveillance strategies to apprehend alleged narcotics dealers. So when Brown presented statistical data from 1958 to 1960 to Parker, he argued that the number of felony arrests only resulted in half of the convictions of the entire state. So Parker contested Brown's data by claiming that the governor's figures were deliberately false. So of course, citing crime statistics to increase police presence in non-white neighborhoods was exploited by the LAPD, but they were also conveniently used to blame higher crime rates on the state Supreme Court decision. So he decried that criminals were engaging in more nefarious transgressions because of the court's Kahan decision to terminate the use of illegal wiretapping. So as an attempt to justify his argument that the exclusionary rule hindered the LAPD's surveillance methods, Parker used statistics of the prison population as evidence to support his assertion of rising lawlessness. He contended that the Kahan ruling impacted the number of prisoners warehoused in California. So beginning in 1945, California prison population saw a steady increase of prisoners, notwithstanding the Korean Civil War, ranging from 10 to 200 a month. So according to Parker, the prison population plateaued in 1955, immediately following the Kahan decision. California reached an all-time high of prisoners 1 month before the case was decided at 15,668 prisoners. The number fell to 15,230, so the math being a 430 prisoner reduction. So in essence, Parker was arguing that for 10 years, the state's prison population rose steadily and was used as a measurement to show the effectiveness of illegal searches while violating a person's Fourth Amendment constitutional rights. Yet none of this mattered to him. Instead, the notion of incarcerated individuals as a marker of safety was pushed onto the public. So for Parker, it was about losing his power to go after a threat he conceived was coming within the country's borders. So by claiming that the people, the white law-abiding citizen, would be in danger of this decision, he stood to gain substantial support from the public. In direct opposition to Parker's opinion was the California Supreme Court. The court warned both the public and the police of the dangers of operating with impunity by stating, quote, "Today, one of the foremost public concerns is the police state, and recent history has demonstrated all too clearly how short the step is from lawless, though efficient enforcement of the law to the stamping of human rights," end quote. This statement angered Parker. The sheer audacity to expose the LAPD as a real menace in human rights violations was preposterous to him. So moreover, Parker described the so-called rising class of criminals as an invasion from within. So when he spoke to the city's business leaders, he often referred to the United States as a democracy that was at risk of sinking into peril by an army of criminals. He was able to construct the other as a foreign invader where Americans' principles were in danger of being subverted by a nascent class of criminal invaders. He described these so-called invaders as an increasing criminal army of approximately 6 million people, suggesting that criminals were somehow organizing themselves to overthrow the American social order. The 6 million figure that Parker evoked was never supported by any evidence. Instead, it was part of his rhetorical appeal to generate a sense of fear among the white public. Quote, "Someday the American people will have to wake up to facts. They had better realize that the criminal army they have in their midst numbers some 6 million people, a number which is far greater than social elements which have overthrown established governments before," end quote. He directly challenged his critics by claiming alleged criminals were ahead of the curve, immersing themselves in technological advancements without any supporting evidence. So it wasn't enough. If that wasn't enough, he also placed blame on the prison system for being too lenient for releasing prisoners early. While the prison system was also rebuked by Parker, he deflected the causes of rising crime away from his department. By censuring the prison system for granting early clemency to incarcerated individuals, he centered the LAPD as an overworked police department that was the only force that stood between criminals and law-abiding citizens. So this is when he came up with the thin blue line rhetoric that is now used today with Blue Lives Matter. So this stems from Parker's ideas. So he called upon people, typically whites, to submit any information that might be useful to apprehending people and reminded them of their obligation and allegiance to the LAPD. The statistical analysis provided by Parker informs us of how he used data to instill fear among the Los Angeles public, claiming that more than half of those paroled re-engaged in criminal activities after early release. While he castigated the parole system in California, he monitored the LAPD, attempting to garner more support by shifting the responsibility on the entire prison system and not his department, who's responsible for arresting non-whites. Though during the 1950s, prisons were not exactly teeming with Black and brown folks, we began to see how they were racially criminalized. Central Division, Newton Division, Hollenbeck divisions consistently led all offenses, a strategy that became useful to Parker as he tightened his grip over a city that was already acquiescing to his demands. So in 1960, during a two-day hearing of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, Parker used the department's aggregated data to argue that African Americans and people of Mexican descent comprised a bulk of the crime. So according to the LAPD, African Americans constituted about 12% of the city's population, but were responsible for nearly half of the city's crime rate at 48.4%. People of Mexican descent made up only 10% of the population, but were held accountable for 20.2% of all criminal complaints. So there are two competing narratives here. One where Parker and the LAPD are responsible for professionalizing police, and the other where non-white communities endured racist police violence in the form of higher arrests per capita. These experiences demonstrate how Parker and the LAPD dehumanized communities through these extra legal tactics, especially when it came to employing statistics as a law enforcement tool. So what I'm arguing is that the LAPD was not only impartial under Parker, and the people who endured a plethora of police misconduct were the ones who wanted, these are the folks who wanted a fresh start, beginning in 1950 in the post-war years. So thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thanks so much, Roberto. That was really interesting presentation. We have our final presentation now by Michelle and group.
Thank you. Hi,
Yeah.
everyone. So it's very good to be with you all here today. And as a note of gratitude, I want to thank the labor behind that togetherness, including the organizers for this session, and our interpreters. So I'm Michelle Brown. I'm here today with Kyra Martinez and Vivian Swayne. We are all in some way, shape, or form associated with the University of Tennessee and the Department of Sociology. We're also closely bound up with our community and our region here in the Appalachian South, and we arrived today heavy because, as probably many of you know, we have been one of the sites labeled as a mass school shooting in national and international news this week. That is not an accurate portrayal, not surprisingly, as we talk about competing narratives today. What we do know at this point is that in the past 48 hours, a student who had brought a gun to campus was shot and killed by police at school. And the narratives have flipped several times to the point at which we now know that in the exchange, a police officer who was shot by either his own weapon or that of his partner. So the emergent story is challenging for us in our community. We have been involved over the past 48 hours as well with organizers whose work is very much a part of what we're here to talk about today. So we're echoing both their traumatization and re-traumatization, as well as their need around what we're working on today. So we were asked by a progressive Black-led city council movement who is seeking transformation in governance, like nearly all American cities right now, right? To do some work around police calls in our community. As critical criminologists, we had an idea of why people call the police before we began this work, and we weren't necessarily surprised in that regard. But part of what we wanted to do was to conceptualize the structural forces that are animating the police call, and to think about very pragmatically about alternatives through organizer knowledges that are appearing everywhere right now and have been long underway in thinking pragmatically about how to deal with harm in our communities. We also ran up very quickly against the idea that most of the alternatives that do develop, particularly popularly, and we heard some of this in Jesse's talk, are efforts that have the propensity to reproduce police and racialized carceral logic. So very challenging spaces. Much like the police stop, we too wanted to theorize the originating act of the police call as something that performs both a legal and lethal form of violence. So this is part of a larger project on the police call as violence. The police call is different in terms of the stop, though, in that it foregrounds public demand, one that's recorded in dispatch records, police websites, and available in police call data. It's also a space in which we see that the call under any condition and for any reason, crime-related or more often not, invokes and expands the power of police. So we view, as many have argued, that the police are set up institutionally to dictate social response to nearly all social problems by way of the police call, but also by way of the tools they employ, in particular criminalization and death. All of this, we would argue, unfolds through the police officer's primary tools: weapons, physical force, handcuffs, citations, uniforms, the badge, the legal and lethal powers to arrest, punish, and kill, all of which arrive at every call scene. I'm going to turn things over to Kyra here, who's going to talk a little bit with Vivian about the categories of calls that we tried to analyze.
So in Knoxville, police calls for service are made publicly available, but to obtain the data we needed, we had to submit a FOIA request. We've got 2 years of data. Police responded during that time to a total of 35,924 calls, which were sorted into 241 categories. Of those categories, we collapsed the most frequent calls for service into 5 major types: property offenses, which were 44%, accident response, which made up 18%, officer initiated at 7%, and interpersonal conflict and violence at 12%. So our study aligned with prior research that the majority of police calls for service relate to nonviolent and/or property offenses, but we weren't really looking at how police spent their time, or obviously interested in response times. We were thinking about how we could key into the difficulties of detention Michelle mentioned earlier, and not reinvent the police form through the exploration of the abolitionist horizon for these 5 key categories. The first of which, property offenses. We are thinking about the police function in this way as no more evident than within its foundational relationship to property. So we were thinking of the inception of police in slave patrols and as strike breakers to their role in the contemporary production of order through the generation of death. So we're situating this and calling upon Marx's conceptualization of private property as theft and the work of critical police, Black, and Indigenous scholars to situate the property call as a present animation of the histories of slavery and conquest foundational to capitalist ownership. So in Knoxville, as with many cities, the most frequent calls for service are related to what is called property crime. Statistics show that police very rarely clear these cases, but that is not their job anyway. Property, in the words of Tyler Wall, is a form of police violence, and the enforcement of property relations is how capitalism defends what it considers just. So for abolitionists and organizers, police protection of property rights ensures a struggle that fetishizes insurgent violence, like looting and property destruction, while intentionally omitting the oppressive and exploitative relations through which racial capitalism and white supremacy reign. So the value of life is diminished by the racialized violence inherent to the policing of property and the defense of whiteness that is made through the property claim. But as the history of police instructs, it is when the oppressed rise to challenge these relations that it reaches its apogee. The strong arm of state force, the police slogan, protect and serve, mandates this property relationship in a carceral form of safety, challenging any meaningful defense of community safety. So we're thinking about the abolishment of theft as inseparable from discussions about the abolition of property and the reconstruction of the commons, which requires new analyses of systems of wealth distribution, taxation, social welfare, including how city budgets generate revenue through the carceral state from fines and asset forfeiture, jail, detention, and other contracts for profit. So the policy platform for the movement for Black Lives tells us the police are not great at investigation services, and especially when the victim is undervalued within society. So address property crime, they put forth an alternative to police in the creation of diverse investigative teams that are built of members from a variety of backgrounds, like sociologists and public health specialists, who are committed to addressing structural inequities and wealth disparities. But the prevention of property harm cannot come, as they are hitting on here, without attending to these underlying issues. And the movement for Black Lives is obviously following historical precedents set by organizers like the Black Panthers, who worked to provide survival programs for community members. But while we think this is an alternative or a worthwhile alternative, investigatory teams risk reproducing the police form and carceral safety under the guise of expertise. So it's imperative that the voices of community members who understand and experience property crime as a strategy for survival not only be included in this conversation, but supported in their efforts to lead and develop forms of interpersonal and structural accountability carefully crafted by racial capitalism. So this is going to take long-term social and structural interventions. Survival programs have been a key space, particularly over the past year, where communities and organizers have worked under emergency conditions to subvert traditions of oppression and police state violence. So this proliferation of mutual aid systems, it performs an alternative form, or gives us an alternative form that's committed to serving people through a continual naming of structural and systemic violences that lead people to rely on property crime for their own survival. So to think about the root causes or altering the root causes of harm, we have to think about a radical expansion of these mutual aid services that promise to change critical infrastructure based on extractive and exploitative economic relations. So we're following here organizations like Black Women's Blueprint, who talk about the unfinished business of civil rights being the struggle for economic stability and self-sufficiency. So we're thinking about how to create sustainable solidarity within communities, thinking about, forms of domestic and labor organizing, but also a reimagining of communities that crafts alternatives to police and builds up these alternative economic structures which nurture our capacities to not only erode capitalism, but create frameworks of justice that are inclusive and intersectional. So we're thinking here too with Black Moms Bailout and organizations that do other work in terms of jail support, coordinating resources at release, what have you, that provide these great examples of ruptural breaks that dismantle to transform. So investigative toward teams and nonprofits and even grassroots efforts may achieve greater funding and legibility in this moment, we are thinking about how they will do more damage than good if they operate as a parody of police whose protection of property is not only organized by a racialized hierarchy, but sutured to the domination and violence of a capitalist world order. And now I turn it to Vivian.
Hey y'all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the three more reasons that people commonly call the police in Knoxville, Tennessee. So 18%, like Kyra said, is calls for accident response. Interstate traffic is visible and audible in most parts of Knoxville, and police are regularly called to respond to motor vehicle crashes and document the situation, mostly for insurance. So in line with other research, rather than fighting crime, officers function as armed insurance adjusters in a world that we're talking about is centered on property and capital. Not only are car accidents one of the top reasons people call the police, it's one of the most common reasons police and citizens interact. And as we know, racial profiling in traffic enforcement is well documented, but also historical discrimination in the insurance sector is calculated on risk tethered to cultural algorithms that make vehicle coverage rates unaffordable for certain groups and increasing the likelihood of them being fined for such regulatory violations. Police represent not safety, but danger to a lot of communities of color. And the impact of racial bias on officers' work-based practices make them less likely to administer first aid to people of color at crash sites. The ways that laws are enacted make them patently unsafe for marginalized group, and we argue that much of police work would be better handled by organizations like Kyra said and workers trained to assist people in doing basic roadside services when needed, solving conflict. So a popular alternative would be quote, like some kind of traffic patroller, but again, we have to take care not to characterize the police. Unlike the police, maybe they would be unarmed without power to arrest. But even arguably effective alternatives to traffic enforcement, such as the proposed expansion of automated enforcement cameras, raise similar concerns. Where cameras get placed, how they get used, who is fined, and how policing power and road safety is expanded must be taken into account for a far simpler route, which is expanding and incentivizing public transportation and pedestrian infrastructures in a city that has limited public transportation and pedestrian sidewalks. So next, 7% of the calls were officer initiated. So the majority of police work is spent on this kind of order maintenance with activities like patrol, assisting citizens, or handling non-emergency situations, taking up the majority of the officer's time. So 7% of these calls are officer initiated and stem not from calls for service, but from police activities like location checks, patrol of hot stops, traffic stops. We see these practices as increasing police scrutiny and discretion within marginalized areas. And here we're kind of discussing alternative forms of community responses. We bring up CAHOOTS, which is Oregon's crisis assisting helping out on the streets. Community members can call CAHOOTS 24/7 and they dispatch a mobile crisis unit that deals with a variety of things from immediate stabilization in the case of medical needs or psychological emergencies, grief and loss, substance abuse. But sometimes they get critiqued from other organizations, again, for forming relationships and reliances on local police. The Dream Defenders has warned us against those kinds of collaborations. And really quick, I see that we just have one more minute, which is so hard because there's so much to talk about. 12% of calls dealt with interpersonal conflict and violence. And we know that when the police get called, not most, but oftentimes that can just increase violence, especially for communities of color. When that violence arises depending on the police it contradicts the goal to reduce violence or sexual violence. And we've kind of made a list of different organizations that have responses and alternatives largely led by Black women, queer, people of color, survivors of intimate and child abuse themselves. So I'll pass it to Michelle just to wrap up. Thank you all.
All right, thanks, Vivian. So the only other category that I wanted to point briefly to is that we were very intrigued with the notion that there are a high number of hang-up calls. So there's this idea that the 911 hang-up is actually this fascinating point from which we can really think about public thinking about the involvement or lack of involvement of the police. Americans call 911 nearly 240 million times a year, and nearly 80 million of those calls are hang-ups. To which the police try and call back, and those are usually unanswered as well. In the end, a third of police calls are canceled, so much so that it is raised within the literature as a threat to emergency and order itself, the hang-up call. So we like to think about that, though, as a dark zone in relation to the violence work of police. That is filled with these inadvertent ambiguities and carries little to no information, but invokes a space of reimagining that asks us what kind of cultural work's actually going on with the missed dials, the pocket dials, the cell phone malfunctions, the change in circumstances, and the glitches, with the glitch here being the possibility to reveal the non-need and conflicted desire for cops. So I'm not going to say a lot more. I'm eager to get to your questions. We have so much more to say. We're working on a large project and a very large paper that we're happy to share with many of you at some point. What might social and legal responses to various forms of emergency, abandonment, violence, as well as mundane non-criminal nuisances, accidents, and conflicts look like in which we do not call police or invoke jails and prisons? We know that's a question that we're all trying to ask right now. And in what situations in which we must, what infrastructure has already failed us? That's where we'll leave things today. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Michelle, Kyra, and Vivian, for your presentation around the 911 data call. Now, the floor is open for questions, and the participants can either put questions in the chat, or you can just write your name or put a question mark in the chat if you want to ask the question verbally.
I have a couple of questions to get us started. So one of the first things that I want us to sort of jump right into is how did you react to the title of this particular session, right? Black radical traditions co-opted. Does anyone want to take a stab at sort of explaining to us how they processed through that title announcement?
I guess that's a question to any one of the presenters, if anyone wants to take that question.
I would just quickly say that at least the way I read that as the framing was one in which we were positioned there in part because the consistent demands from Black-led community movement work in our case is one that's often co-opted in ways to demands, radical demands shifted to requests for more police. And it happens all the time through a lot of what I was thinking through in terms of both Jesse and Roberto's talks, in terms of what Jesse's arguing with how white liberals often conceptualize and shift the work that's being done and the demands that are being made. And also through these competing narratives that more often than not police control when they have the ear of government and the media.
Anyone else?
Jesse, Roberto, Kyra, Vivian, anyone else wants to respond to that question? Okay, thanks. So we have a question by Amy. Is there a way to work on separating police from 911 medical and other calls? Thanks, Amy.
That is such an important question. I don't know that we looked into too much about that. We did, when we were gathering the data, which was a process, go to the dispatch call center in Knoxville. I like that question because it's like, yeah, that should be part of the conversation, and like thinking about different phone numbers besides 911, or like, I don't know if anyone else has anything to.
I just wanted to jump in there really quickly because I think this is changing on the ground really quickly. So if you actually go and look at Austin, who's been able to withdraw a substantive amount of money out of the policing budget and may be able to continue that, they actually are doing a lot of that work by separating calls and doing it through various forms of task forces. I know Oakland's trying to do it too. So there's a lot of different spaces in which exactly those sorts of things are taking shape right now. But it literally is changing daily, which is good.
Amy has also asked for references if you can provide. So feel free to put that in the chat. And we have another question for the panelist. So BLM platform not only calls for defunding the police, but also to invest in communities. How does your research engage with the idea of not only rethinking policing structures, but actually investing on Black communities and people themselves? Thanks, Louise.
I can answer that. As far as my research is concerned, I'm looking at mine is historical in nature, and part of the argument is that with these bloated budgets that the police now have, the research that I've been engaging in, a lot of it stems from the LAPD, particularly with SWAT. SWAT was the brainchild of Daryl Gates. It was something that Parker and him talked about, but Parker started implementing these like paramilitary structures where he cut out a lot of people that directly, basically the bureaucratic structure is that he wanted people to report to him. And he argued for increased police salaries, meaning like using crime statistics as a vehicle to say that the public needs to be protected as a whole. But when he was referring to the public, he was talking about white people. He wasn't talking about Black and brown folks. So in order for us to move ahead, I think that, and this is just part of my thinking, is that we have to look at these root causes of where did this come from? Where did this idea of pumping so much money into the police departments, who started a lot of these policies? And from what I found so far is that Parker was responsible for this. And the other thing too that I mentioned in my talk is this notion of Blue Lives Matter, right? Blue Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter is like, stop killing us. Your response is Blue Lives Matter. Are you serious? Just, that's offensive. But it stems from the thin blue line rhetoric that Parker used to always espouse and say, we stand between chaos and order. And if you get rid of us, then the country, particularly Los Angeles, is gonna devolve into chaos. So this is how I'm thinking about like looking ahead in the futures. And in order for us to look ahead, we have to look at where a lot of this stems from.
Also, just really quickly, I want to jump into, so I think in terms of with my research, right, I think one of the main point that I wanted to make is that, you know, it's irrelevant whether or not, or it's not the point of how you know, non-Black liberal activists kind of interpret what Black Lives Matter or defunding the police means, right? It's the fact that they're doing so while also making irrelevant what the activists and the Black folks who are affected by the problem are thinking, right? And I think, you know, as myself also a non-Black person, that's something that I think about a lot, right? That is to say, you know, what does it mean to kind of speak on behalf of this issue or to speak about this issue while not thinking about what, Black folks on the ground are thinking and talking about. Right? So thank you for the question.
Okay, so we have a question from Luis. Luis, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you. This has been really great. I just want to say how much I appreciate all the ideas and the thoughts to all of you. I've really enjoyed this. A quick question for the team that's doing the calls for service. I'm doing a similar project where I'm conceptualizing, I'm trying to figure out, I'm thinking of abolitionist perspective in terms of the reduction of the criminal justice system, right? Ideally, eliminating it would be fantastic, but I don't quite see a strategy related to that right now. So I'm looking for a way to shrink it. And one of the ways to do that, it seems policing as the entry point that has contact with people, specific groups of people. And then once they make the contact, they move through that system and end up in all the other stuff that we know so well. So one of the things that I'm focusing in on is how to narrow down, if you think of the entry point like this, how to make it as narrow as possible. And because of Black Lives Matter and the activists in the streets, we have a possibility to actually begin to reduce the scope and funding of police in significant ways and remove the money and put it in the ways that people are supporting. Sorry, this is a long way of saying that I'm with you, I'm following, this is really great. I'm wondering what you, in terms of your data and the data that you received in the calls for service is a very technical question. What format did you get it? How did you analyze it? What kinds of granular level information existed in that data that might allow us to understand how to take away things? That's my question.
Vivian, I think you should recount a little bit of that just because you were our go-to person there. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I am. I'll at least talk about like retrieving the data. It took a minute. It took going to several different buildings, state buildings, back and forth. And yeah, it honestly took like a little bit of like charisma and almost like flirting with the state to try and like get because at first the project has kind of shifted, and at first they gave us really bad data. It was full of redactions, and so we were just like being kind of bumped back and forth trying to get non-redacted data, and I ended up having to like go in person and have a meeting, and the person was really nice and they actually got it to me really quick. But it was a lot of hoops to get to that end goal. And then the form of the data, I think, Kyra, you knew how many like categories there were. It's like over, I don't remember, 200 or something.
241.
241. That was really interesting too, trying to break down and collapse the categories. What was the second part of your question though? How we got the data, how they gave us the data.
Yes, Luis, you can go on.
Yeah, just the question was, what format, what did it look like? And what kinds of, was it aggregate information or what kind of, at the granular level, were you able to categorize very specific kinds of things that were there, or was it kind of redacted and reduced in terms of aggregation information?
It was reduced. So what's really interesting too is every day for the calls for service, they put it on, it's publicly accessible. So you can just download a PDF daily for all the reasons, right? It was daily for all the reasons people call the police. So at first, Kyra was like downloading every single day into Google Drive. But we ended up getting the data in, it was a huge Excel sheet. We have a data person, he's not here, but he was the one who took, I think it was PDFs. We had to convert it to an Excel, and then we started collapsing, or he kind of collapsed it.
And it didn't have, Luis, a lot of the data we had hoped for. We would have had to gone into the original reports to get some of that. And even there, a lot of the racial data was being erased as we understood it. So for suspicious persons, for instance. So we were concerned, overall with the kind of data we were getting, and just did a more focus, just basically looking at categories like we did today.
We did get specific addresses where they were called to, and then we got things like the 10 code. We had a report ID, but no demographic information was given to us. That was in the reports that were taken, and you had to pay $10 a piece for access to those, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks. So we have our next question from James, and this one is for Kyra. How do we move public perceptions to prioritize human rights above property rights?
If any of my co-presenters want to help me out here, that's a big question. And I do think that that we have to think about rights and what we mean by rights, and that in terms of how we are framing our study through laws, legal violence, right? And the claim to rights has historically, been complicated, but I think that public perception changes a lot around the kinds of organizing we're highlighting here. So the continual dismantling of these systems through the work that's being done on the ground by activists. So I think it's just it's something that we're engaged in over the long term. I don't know if that's right. Just Michelle, Viv, you got anything?
I just wanted to jump in really quickly and say, I love the question. It reminds me of the earlier question about, not just defunding the police, but it looks like coupling all of this with things like anti-eviction strategies and houselessness. Knoxville has another very huge issue around homelessness camps and policing and gentrification. So all of those, I think, are ways to really highlight that human rights dimension.
Okay, thanks both. So we have another question from Marina. Marina?
Thank you. Sorry about that. I automatically pressed the unmute button and remuted myself. Thank you so much. This has been a really, really interesting conversation. My question is for Jesse. I found myself getting really angry during your presentation, not at you, but obviously at the data that you were presenting. And my question was, so there's this sort of notion of problematizing the idea of research or objectivity, especially in abolitionist and social justice work. I know that's an important part of empirical research in more traditional settings, and obviously don't know what your politics are, but you're participating in this conference, so I'm assuming that you have abolitionist sympathies. And I'm curious about if any component of your project involved re-education, or if not, or even if so, kind of what your feelings were grappling with the data that you were finding.
And this is just to mark time that we have less than 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I think just really quickly, the project itself does not involve any kind of re-education, even though I do try to probe a lot deeper into what folks are thinking. I think like you, I'm often shocked or kind of angered by a lot of things that my respondents are saying, and especially as I move on to interviewing conservative folks, that's especially more the case. I think one of my kind of central theses that I hope to get across with my project is also this idea of kind of whose perspective people are able to take and what people are thinking, right? And like are able to imagine, right? And I think it seems to me that, most of them are not doing so in a way of like, I intentionally want to decenter Black folks or try to co-opt the agenda or, you know, in all these kind of different ways, right? That comes from a really kind of knee-jerk reaction in places where people may or may not come with good intention, right? And so it's even more important for us to figure out how people who may or may not have, you know, real sympathy with the movement and why is it that they're not able to understand what people are trying to convey.
Okay, thanks so much. So I do not see any more question. So thanks so much. Oh, would you?
Well, I just wanted to say that some of these conversations are very complicated, and I do apologize that we're running out of time because there's so much here to flesh out, so many different problematics to account for, especially this is going to be recorded and we're probably going to get some backlash. So I invite folks to really sort of bring their critiques to the forum for those critiques, and maybe we can flesh those out there if there is time. Otherwise, thank everybody so much for your time and for your research, and I hope we can find other ways to engage and keep engaging.
And special thanks to Rarity and Jaren for helping us with the ASL interpretation. And don't go too far away. We have in next 20 minutes our second keynote with Professor Alex Vitale. Thank you so much. Thanks all.
Thank you.